4 submarines carry 616 Tomahawk cruise missiles between them and the U.S. Navy doesn't have a simple way to replace that firepower when those boats retire. According to a recent analysis published by 1945, matching that combined missile capacity with the Navy's newest class of attack submarine would take roughly 22 new hulls. Not 2, not 4, 22. That's the real story here. Why replacing 4 submarines takes so many more boats than you'd expect, and what that shortfall says about the state of America's submarine fleet right now in the summer of 2026. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk through the actual math behind that number 22. How 4 Cold War-era submarines ended up carrying 616 missiles combined, why their intended successor carries so much less firepower per hull, and what the Navy's own shipbuilding numbers say about whether that gap can realistically close before the older boats age out of service. This isn't a story about a canceled program or a secret plan. It's a story about arithmetic and what that arithmetic quietly exposes about the American submarine fleet. Start with the 4 boats at the center of this. The USS Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and Georgia were not originally built as cruise missile submarines at all. They began their service lives as Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, the Navy's Cold War nuclear deterrent, each one designed to carry Trident missiles on patrol for months at a time. When the United States and Russia signed arms reduction agreements in the early 2000s limiting the number of strategic missile launchers each side could field, the Navy faced a choice: retire 4 of its 18 Ohio-class boats outright, or convert them into something else entirely. It chose conversion. Between 2002 and 2008, the Navy rebuilt all 4 submarines from the inside out. 22 of the original 24 missile tubes were re-engineered to hold something very different from a single ballistic missile. Each converted tube can now hold 7 Tomahawk cruise missiles at once, packed into what the Navy calls a multiple all-up-round canister. Do that math across 22 tubes on 4 submarines, and you get the number this video opened with: up to 616 Tomahawks, ready to fire, spread across just 4 hulls. The remaining 2 tubes on each boat were converted differently, into lockout chambers that let Navy SEALs and other special operations forces deploy from the submarine while it stays submerged. I went back through the Navy's own historical fact files and the public contract record to check that math, and it holds up. This isn't an estimate. It's how the conversion was actually engineered. What you end up with is a class of submarine, now officially designated SSGN, that functions less like a traditional attack submarine and more like an underwater missile magazine, capable of launching a saturation strike or supporting a special operations mission without ever surfacing. It's worth pausing on what a Tomahawk actually is for anyone who hasn't followed naval programs closely. It's a long-range, subsonic cruise missile, launched vertically from a submerged tube that flies low toward a fixed target hundreds of miles away using its own guidance system rather than a pilot. The Navy has fired them from submarines and surface ships in nearly every major conflict since the Gulf War, which is exactly why a submarine that can carry over 100 of them at once and reload from a magazine that size before ever having to return to port is such a concentrated amount of striking power. A vertical launch system, or VLS, is simply the set of missile tubes built into a ship or submarine's hull that let it fire that kind of weapon without surfacing or exposing a deck gun. None of this is exotic technology by 2026 standards. What's unusual is having so much of it built into 4 hulls at once. The SSGN program's own history has an obstacle worth mentioning too, because it shaped the fleet the Navy is now trying to replace. The 2002 conversion wasn't a simple retrofit. Engineers had to redesign missile tubes originally built to launch a single ballistic missile so they could instead hold and eject 7 much smaller cruise missiles apiece without compromising the pressure hull or the reactor systems around them. It took roughly 6 years and billions of dollars across all 4 boats. The Navy solved it by treating the conversion as a full midlife overhaul rather than a quick modification, refueling the reactors at the same time so each SSGN came out of the yard with decades of remaining service life. That's part of why these 4 boats have stayed so valuable for so long, and part of why their retirement, whenever it fully arrives, leaves a gap that isn't trivial to fill. That brings us to the problem. All 4 of these submarines are approaching the end of their planned service lives. Submarine hulls, particularly ones built around a nuclear reactor and pressurized to survive at depth, can't simply be refueled and kept running indefinitely. At some point, the reactor core and the hull itself reach the limit of what refit work can safely extend. The Navy has known for years that the Ohio-class SSGNs would need to retire on a defined schedule, and that schedule is now closing in. The question the 1945 analysis raises is what replaces them, and that's where the obstacle shows up. The submarine the Navy is actually building right now, the Virginia-class attack submarine, was never designed to be a missile magazine the way the converted Ohio boats are. Its primary job is different, hunting other submarines, gathering intelligence, and delivering torpedoes and a smaller missile load as one part of a broader toolkit, not as its single defining feature. Depending on the exact production block, a Virginia-class boat carries a fraction of the vertical launch missile capacity that a converted Ohio SSGN does. Later Virginia-class boats, built with an added mid-body section called the Virginia Payload Module, do carry more missile tubes than earlier ones. But even with that upgrade, matching the raw combined total of 616 missiles requires stacking up boat after boat after boat. That's the arithmetic behind 22. It isn't a Navy replacement plan. It's an analyst's capacity estimate, a way of expressing, in a single comparable number, just how much more concentrated the old SSGN's firepower is than the new submarines. According to the report, if you wanted to preserve the same total missile count the 4 Ohio boats provide today using only Virginia-class hulls, you'd need something in the neighborhood of 22 of them assigned to that role alone. Here's the part that doesn't sit right once you look at the shipbuilding numbers. 22 submarines is not a small ask. It's larger than the number of Virginia-class boats the Navy has commissioned across the entire life of the program to date. And building submarines has become the hard part. Congressional and Navy officials have said for several years running that the submarine industrial base, the shipyards, the specialized suppliers, the trained welders and pipe fitters cannot currently deliver Virginia-class boats at the pace the Navy's own long-term shipbuilding plan calls for. The contracted target has been roughly 2 Virginia-class submarines a year. Actual deliveries have frequently fallen short of that, closer to 1 a year in recent cycles, according to Navy budget testimony and Government Accountability Office reviews of the program. Put yourself in the position of a Navy planner looking at this problem. You have 4 boats retiring on a fixed timeline set by their reactors and hulls. You have a replacement submarine that, boat for boat, carries a smaller missile load. And you have a shipyard system that's already behind on the number of submarines it's contracted to deliver before you even add a theoretical 22-boat missile replacement requirement on top of that backlog. That's the obstacle underneath this story. And it's not one a single contract or a single shipyard expansion fixes quickly. The Navy has been trying to address it. Multi-year procurement contracts for the Virginia-class, new investment in workforce training programs at yards in Connecticut and Virginia, and expanded supplier contracts have all been part of the response over the past several years. Whether those efforts close the gap in time is still unresolved, and it's worth being precise about what's confirmed here and what isn't. It is confirmed from Navy contract announcements and budget documents that Virginia-class production has run behind its stated schedule. It is confirmed from the Ohio-class conversion program's own engineering record how the 616 missile figure was reached. What is not confirmed is any official Navy plan to build 22 submarines specifically to replace SSGN missile capacity. That number is the analyst's estimate of what parity would require, not a line item in a shipbuilding budget. There's a detail in the shipbuilding reports that stuck with me while putting this together. The Virginia-class program isn't only competing for yard space and skilled labor against its own production targets. It's also competing against the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program, the Navy's top shipbuilding priority, which uses many of the same suppliers, the same limited pool of nuclear-qualified welders, and in some cases, the same dry docks. Every Columbia-class hull under construction is, in a very literal sense, capacity that isn't available for building the next Virginia-class boat. That's not a hidden fact. It shows up plainly in GAO testimony and Navy budget justifications, but it rarely makes it into a headline about missile counts, even though it's arguably the more important constraint on whether 22 additional hulls is realistic on any near-term timeline. That constraint on its own would be a hard enough problem, but it isn't the only one competing for the same shipyards, and that's where the next piece of this story picks up. What strikes us about this comparison is less the number 22 itself, and more what it reveals about how differently the Navy has had to think about submarine design over the past 2 decades. The Ohio conversion was, in effect, a one-time windfall. 4 already built strategic hulls repurposed into an unmatched conventional strike asset because the Arms Control Treaty made 4 missile submarines available for something other than their original mission. The Virginia class was never going to replicate that by accident. It was designed from the outset as a multi-mission attack submarine, not a floating missile silo, and that design choice is exactly why closing this gap requires quantity rather than a single new class of boat. Here's the take that'll probably split opinion. Measuring submarine replacement purely by missile count may be the wrong way to think about this in the first place. A raw Tomahawk tally treats every launch tube as interchangeable, but it says nothing about a submarine's ability to avoid detection, gather intelligence, or operate independently in contested waters. Missions where the newer Virginia-class boats, with their quieter reactors and updated sensor suites, arguably outperform the older converted hulls they're being measured against. Reducing this to a single number makes for a clean headline. It may not make for a complete picture of actual naval capability. So here's a genuinely open question, and we'd like to know where you land on it. Does it even make sense to replace the SSGN's missile capacity on a strict one-for-one basis with new submarines? Or should some of that firepower shift to other platforms entirely, surface ships, or the growing arsenal of long-range missiles now being fielded on Navy destroyers and cruisers? There's no official answer to that yet. It's an open policy question, not a settled one. Where this actually stands today, all 4 Ohio-class SSGNs remain in active service, still deployable, still able to carry out the strike and special operations missions they've performed for nearly 2 decades. The Virginia-class program continues under multi-year contracts with General Dynamics, Electric Boat, and Huntington Ingalls Industries, with new boats entering service on a rolling basis even as the industrial base works to close its delivery gap. No public Navy document lays out a formal one-to-one replacement plan for SSGN missile capacity. The 22-boat figure exists in the public conversation because of this kind of independent analysis, not because the Pentagon has adopted it as a target. There's a piece of the shipbuilding math we couldn't independently verify from public sources. The exact missile tube count on the very latest Virginia payload module boats varies slightly depending on which Navy or contractor document you check, and the newest figures aren't always public. If you want us to dig further into that specific number and report back, tell us in the comments. We do read them. What isn't in dispute is the underlying pressure this creates. The Navy is retiring a uniquely concentrated source of conventional strike power at the same time it is trying to recover its submarine construction pace, fund the Columbia-class program described a moment ago, and maintain readiness against submarine fleet growth in the Indo-Pacific that Navy officials have flagged repeatedly in congressional testimony. None of those pressures are secret. What's less certain is how the Navy will ultimately balance them, and whether the answer looks anything like 22 more Virginia-class hulls, some smaller number spread across other platforms, or a mix nobody has publicly settled on yet. For anyone who wants to check this reporting against the primary sources rather than take our word for it, the Navy's own fact files on both submarine classes are public, as are the Government Accountability Office's regular reports on submarine construction, and the Congressional Research Service's shipbuilding briefs updated most years with the latest delivery numbers. The math behind the SSGN's missile capacity, the Virginia-class production schedule, and the industrial base bottleneck are all things you can trace yourself in public documents without relying on any single outlet's interpretation of them, including ours. That's the real story behind a number that sounds, on its surface, like a simple substitution problem. 4 boats. 22 boats. It isn't simple at all, and the Navy's own paperwork is where that becomes clear.